Thank you for being on the journey with us this month and for being here for this final panel. Alex and Don discussed platforms, misinformation, and the effect on the news and information ecosystem around the world. Now, our final guests will discuss some of the actions news organizations are taking or can take to counter misinformation and to rebuild your trust. Our moderator this evening is a 2019 JSK Fellow. She's seated in the center. It is Mandy Jenkins. She was the first editor-in-chief at Storyful, where she oversaw a team that worked with newsrooms to find, verify, and publish eyewitness media and social insights from around the world. She is president of the Online News Association's Board of Directors. To your left, Dr. Meredith Clark. Dr. Clark is a former journalist and an assistant professor in the Department of Media Studies at the University of Virginia. Her research focuses on the intersections of race, media, and power, and she has done deep research into social media communities and their attitudes on trust and the media. Seated next to Dr. Clark is Sally Lehrman. Sally is Senior Director of the Journalism Ethics Program at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. She leads the Trust Project, an international collaboration to strengthen public confidence in the news. Many news organizations, as well as the platforms such as Google and Facebook, are participants in that. She is also a 1996 alumna of the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships. Seated next to Mandy on the other side is Aaron Sharockman. Aaron is the executive director of PolitiFact, the largest fact-checking organization in the United States, which won the Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting in 2009 for its coverage of the 2008 presidential election. If you've seen the Truth-O-Meter, measuring the truth of stories, PolitiFact is the organization that gives you that. And seated next to Aaron is Lynn Walsh. Lynn is project manager for a project called Trusting News, an initiative at the University of Missouri, which tests strategy for improving the trust readers have in news organizations. She serves on the national board for the Society of Professional Journalists and served as president in 2016-2017. That's your panel for the evening and your final panel for the class. Take it away, Mandy.
Thanks, Michael. So, as we've seen over the course of this class these past few weeks, there are lots of obstacles standing between journalists and the public that used to be the audience. We have economic forces that are squeezing local newsrooms. We have crackdowns on freedom around the world. And now we also have bad actors using the tools of mass media to spread disinformation. But sometimes the barrier is all of these things and none of these things at the same time. It's a failing of trust between newsrooms and their audiences, and between people and the institutions that they used to trust a long time ago. And that's our focus for this panel tonight. So in 1976, Gallup found that 72% of Americans had confidence in the news media. And since that time, the trust in journalism has plummeted. So I want to start with Sally, here to my right. You've done research on how the audience interacts with the news and has seen some of this over time. So how did we get here? How did we get to this place right now?
Boy, there's a question. So I think back to 1997 when actually the seeds of the Trust Project began. And I gathered together a group of editors and we were thinking about, well, what is it that, what kind of journalism ethics should we be thinking about in this digital era? And I heard a lot from them right at that moment, so this was 20 plus years ago, about their concerns that the digital environment was degrading the quality of the news and was degrading the ethics of news. And fast forward 20 years, and I came to Santa Clara University and had a faculty position, and we brought together a similar group of editors from around the US, and they were talking about the same thing. And so I thought, well, we really shouldn't be talking about this anymore. We should be trying to figure out what's wrong and find a way to address it. And their concern at that time, and 4 years ago when I brought the same kinds of people back together, was again that the digital environment that we were just hearing about was really supporting clicks. It was supporting the worst of journalism because everyone was out there rushing to get the clicks, was rushing to write the kind of headlines that would grab people's emotions, and maybe setting aside some of their ethics for that reason. So I was thinking, can't we flip the picture and use the digital environment towards supporting the greater good, or the kinds of good that journalism really does? And so this problem of trust in the news is not new, as you said. It was data dating back to the 70s. I believe that a lot of it did start, or it worsened with the digital environment, and these editors were really seeing that this was going to happen. And now, of course, we have these incredible forces. We've seen it manifest. Incredible forces of misinformation, of still the clickbait problem. We have increasing uncertainty on the part of the public because of the misinformation and all the, as you're getting 2/3 of people are getting 2/3 of their news from social or search today. So they're not seeing the brand necessarily, or you're not seeing the brand. You're going right to an article and you don't necessarily know where it's coming from, and it looks exactly like all other kinds of information. So of course there's a lot of uncertainty about where is this coming from. And then finally there are deliberate efforts to undermine the public's faith in the news. Now, the other piece, of course, is that journalism has not always done right by the public, and we do make a lot of mistakes. And there are populations that we have not covered well at all for a long time. So combine all these forces in the digital environment with the problems that have been within the process of journalism for some time, the business model declining, and now we've got a really bad, toxic equation. So what we did was, as I was thinking about, well, how do we flip the picture? Where do we begin to address this trust project? I thought, well, we can't keep talking among journalists. It's time to go out and really talk to the public. And so inspired, in fact, by what I learned here at Stanford, coming back as an alum to the Knight Fellowship program, we did empathy interviews with the public and went one-on-one with people and asked them across Europe and the US, across race, class, gender, generation, and geography, what is it you value in the news? When do you trust it? And when don't you? And out of that, to me, came some encouraging discoveries. And I'll just tell you briefly what they are, and then I'll let you ask some more questions. But so we were able to find 4 user types. And one is the avid news user, and that's probably many of you in the room. And those are people that are out there checking and cross-checking the news, and then pushing it out through your networks to help guide others. Then there's the engaged news user who is interested in the news, maybe subscribes, talks about it with friends and family, but is a little bit overwhelmed and uncertain. Then we have the opportunistic, who is the type of person who just doesn't have time to pursue the news. And so it's just, they're there when it washes over them, maybe in the break room, it's on the television, or they get a notification on their phone. And then the angry and disengaged, and those are the ones that we worry about most in journalism. The part that I feel is encouraging is that, number one, across all those groups, there was lots of expression that news matters. It's just, from the angry, disengaged point of view, well, it matters to us, but we don't think it's doing a good job. And then across the middle, there was a lot of uncertainty about what to trust or not. So I feel that we can, through things like what we're doing at the Trust Project, we can engage those avid folks to help people down the line. And so what we do is provide these trust indicators to the public, and I'll tell you more about them later, but essentially provide the tools to help people know who and what is behind the news so that each group can help the other to do a better job of really becoming an informed news user.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks for giving us the foundation for where we're starting off from here today. And actually, that's a great seg. Lynn, I wanted to ask you, in trusting news, you guys do a lot, especially when we're talking about research into transparency, media literacy. What are some findings that you guys have found in your work so far about essentially how we've been talking here with Sally?
Yeah, so at the Trusting News Project, we work directly with newsrooms. So these are local newspapers, local television stations, online-only news organizations. And with their help, we were able to talk to their audiences. So people like you who might read the newspaper, watch the news. And what we found is that primarily, people said, news consumers said that they want ethical, responsible journalism. They want journalism that is going to show opposing viewpoints. They want journalism that's going to show context. They want journalism that is going to include multiple sources. And there were some outliers on there that said, most of journalism is biased, but for the most part, people wanted journalism, just good, ethical, responsible journalism. And the things that they said that they wanted, what's interesting about it is they're things that journalists are already doing day to day. So once we get a story, we're making multiple calls. You may only see that one person on TV that we talked to, or you may only see one quote in the newspaper, but there were multiple people that we talked to. So that's just one example. So what we're trying to do at the Trusting News Project is, because journalists are doing what the public wants them to do to be responsible and to be responsible journalists, but journalists are doing a lousy job basically of showing the public how we do those things and that we even do those things. So we're working directly with journalists to get them to explain more about how our process works, talk and be very, very specific about what is news, what is opinion, also being very careful to not use journalism jargon in everyday reporting. So basically just to be more transparent with everything that we're doing so that the public is very aware that we are doing these things that you want us to do. And the goal is that if they know that we're doing this, can we meet at a point then to then talk about the content that we're sharing, instead of having these assumptions that are made that generally are negative.
Thank you. I definitely want us to return to that concept of transparency and media literacy a little bit later. But I want to shift for a second, because we talk about the public, and that's a lot of people. That's a pretty wide look at that. But I'd like to shift to look at some specific audiences we're talking about trust. So Dr. Clark, you've done some really great work looking at social media subcultures and minority communities, and I'd really like to know, how does it disconnect between what's discussed in those communities and then what is reported in mainstream media about those communities affecting the trust there?
Mm-hmm. Some of the things I've seen, I study specifically one Twitter subculture called Black Twitter, and Black Twitter is comprised of Black users of Twitter who use the service in a very distinct way, one that's easily surveilled online. The way that Black Twitter users use the platform to communicate with one another is heavily influenced by culture and cultural references. It is embedded with symbolic meaning, and it has context that is often missing from news stories. Some of the problems that we've heard about historically have to do with a lack of coverage of certain communities, including Black communities. And so some of the things that you see Black Twitter doing is that in the coverage that is deficient of the backstory, the context, the history that you would want to see in journalism about your community, Black Twitter provides for one another.
So how much, and kind of following up on that, how much is sort of the culture within these communities on social media, I guess somewhat in conflict with the lack of diversity in newsrooms covering that same community?
Well, I would definitely say that there's a correlation between the two. I am currently running the American Society of News Editors Newsroom Diversity Survey, which was initially developed in 1968, 10 years after the Kerner Commission report came out and made this indictment of national news media for failing to cover Black communities in particular adequately and fairly. And since 1978, the survey has tracked the number of journalists of color in different newsrooms across the country, and also of women in newsrooms across the country. And some of the things that we've seen is that since about 2012, there's been kind of a plateauing of the number of journalists of color in these newsrooms. So what we're seeing online in these social media spaces and making up for those deficiencies is providing news that the people who are absent from the newsrooms can't. Some of the reporting that you've seen from places like Ferguson on the ground coming directly from social media activists, some of the things that you've seen in terms of breaking down social media movements like the Black Lives Matter movement as they unfurl has come through these communities on Twitter. So it's people who are able to, because of their access to the platforms, the speed of the platforms, and their knowledge of very specific and specialized subjects, are able to do some sort of reporting that is different than what we get from mainstream media.
Thank you. So, when we're talking about trusted news organizations, and I think that probably is one of those things that depends on who you ask, I'm sure, from what we know here in this room versus maybe some other people out there. We know what it is that we trust. Now, PolitiFact is often on that list, and so is Snopes. I know my mom, who is a big not truster of media, especially considering I'm in the media, but she loves Snopes. She calls it Snoops. She will send everything to Snoops to make sure it's real. And PolitiFact, it really has been a big mover in that space as well, especially when it pertains to political news. So, Aaron, I'm interested to hear from you. Is it the case that PolitiFact's really trusted? Do you guys still kind of get charged with being the fake media these days?
Sure, yes. Well, first, thanks for having me. And since 2016, fact-checking is kind of in vogue. And so I get invited to a lot of these panels. This is the first one where I'm the only guy on the stage. And so kudos to Michael and Don for putting together a diverse panel. That's excellent. Yeah, the answer is yes. So we just fact-checked a claim by Ted Cruz earlier this week or last week. He had claimed that since the president's tax cut bill had passed, tax revenues have gone up. And he was saying that this is evidence that the tax cuts are working. More people are having more money in their pocket, and still yet more monies are coming into the federal bank. The facts of this are nominally, yes, there's a little bit more money that the government is taking in, but by every kind of actual important measure, it's the lowest growth in revenues in the federal to the federal treasury in decades. When you adjust for inflation, it's actually down, things like that. So we rated that claim half true. And when we published the claim, we said half true. The number is nominally up, but when you kind of really peel back the layers of the onion, you'll find a lot of problems with this. Ted Cruz gets on Twitter and says, "Liberal lion PolitiFact out to get me again. They literally said revenues have gone up, and they still say half true." How could they? 10 minutes later, Paul Krugman, New York Times, you'd probably consider him a progressive, a liberal. "I really don't agree with PolitiFact on this one. They were way too easy on Ted Cruz." I kind of take that as a badge of honor on both sides and say maybe we're in the right place. But the point is, when it comes to politics, and in the partisan space we're in right now, it is very difficult, I think, for anyone to truly trust anything. At PolitiFact, we try every day to be as transparent and as fair and objective as possible. We were probably, and I could be wrong on this, but as far as I know, when we started in 2007, we were probably the first website to literally have a bibliography with every newspaper article we wrote that listed every source we considered, every source we talked to, whether or not they were included in the final article. We had hyperlinks to all of our source material. I'm told this is terrible for SEO, but I really like a paragraph that says something like, "If you want to see the report, click here." We do that so you can read it. We try in everything we do to be as transparent as possible so you can help make decisions about who you're going to vote for, what policies you stand for. That all adds up to still, we're trusted a little bit and sometimes not so much. After the 2016 election, we did a lot of kind of soul searching and found that there are truly pockets of people who defend us, and maybe some of you guys are here, and thank you. But then there are, thank you. But there are a lot of people who try to discredit our work and do it for political gain. And so we are still looking, trust me, at new and different ways to try to create and build trust, because we don't think, we're not even close. If we're trustworthy in your eyes, great, but I think we have a lot more work to do.
So coming back to you, Sally, I'm interested in hearing, and I know you referenced it earlier, but about the sort of the work that you're doing with newsrooms specifically about this right now. We're talking about solving some of the problems. So what is it that you guys are doing, especially with those metrics applied there?
Okay, great. Yeah, I love telling about the Trust Project. So one of the stories that I think really helps see why what we're doing makes sense is that when I travel a lot, I was one trip going back and forth to SFO, I talked to the cab driver both ways, and on the way I thought I had a pretty liberal cab driver, and we got to talking about what I'm doing, and he says, you just can't trust the news. And I said, well, why? I said, because it's completely controlled by big business and government. And then on the way back, I got a driver who I think was pretty conservative, and again, got to talking about what I do, and he says, can't trust the news. I'm like, well, why? Well, because it's completely controlled by big business and government. So what the Trust Project is doing is working with newsrooms around the world to help give the people the information they need in order to understand how journalism is distinct from all other kinds of information that really are controlled by business or government. That this is the only kind of information that is truly designed to serve the public interest. So what we do, we have, right now we have 120 news sites showing these things called the trust indicators, and they are transparency factors that provide information to you built from the user research we did and from work done by senior executives from 80 different news organizations who came together to marry what users said would help them understand whether or not to trust a site, married that with journalistic values. And so we have 8 trust indicators, and what they show to the public is information about who and what is behind the news. So what are the principles and policies that that this organization stands by? So what is their ethics commitment? What is conflict of interest? How do they deal with that? What do they have a commitment to bringing in diverse voices? What do they do when they make a mistake? How do they make their corrections? Where and when do they place them? Information about the author. So who is this person that's producing the news? What's their expertise? Labels, is it news? Is it analysis? Is it opinion? Is it some sort of content that has been paid for by the advertiser? Because we heard a lot from users that it felt like journalism was sort of merging those things, and people were unhappy about that. Also, getting to what we heard a minute ago, how do you know what you know, journalists? So for some stories, information about the actual sources that were, more information about the sources that went into that story, just like PolitiFact is doing. And finally, information about, is there local expertise built into this story? And in a way, is it locally sourced? Do they know about my demographic group? Do they know about my region? Were they actually there? And how much public engagement does this news organization really engage in? So these are all shown to the public. And then there's also signals that are provided to the news distribution platforms connected to those things that you see. And the idea there is, because so much is seen through these social media platforms and search, that can we help them do a better job of surfacing and lifting up trustworthy sources? And as you'll see, the idea here is to provide information to the public so that you can make informed decisions about what you want to trust and what you want to share, as opposed to just sort of handing you this evaluation based on a black box of yes, this is good, or no, this is bad. And as a result, I hope we can really shift the equation so that the public can in fact own these trust indicators and start having a stronger say in holding news organizations accountable, and news organizations will hold themselves more accountable too.
Thanks. Kind of taking off on that theme of the media literacy and transparency, and I know that that's something that both Sally and Lynn, I'm curious to know, why is it that we are very much invested in the idea that media literacy and transparency is going to win back trust?
So I think it comes back to what I mentioned earlier in the fact that the public doesn't understand how journalism works and doesn't know how a journalist does their job. And why would they? We have never told them. It's just like, I've never run a kitchen at a restaurant, so how would I know how to do that, right? We haven't kind of torn back the pieces to show them. So the idea is that if we can explain and if we can tell them how we do our jobs, then instead of them having to make assumptions about how we do it, which normally turn out to be negative, we can meet at a place of mutual understanding to then discuss maybe how the journalism could be better, things we maybe could have done differently, instead of this negative assumption that comes to place that I'll give an example, one that's very common, the use of an anonymous source. I know anytime I ask a member of the public that's a non-journalist what it means when someone has used an anonymous source, I get varied answers. A lot of times people assume that we've never even met the person and or know exactly who that person is. Well, it's actually the complete opposite. If I'm an editor and my reporter wants to use an anonymous source, I probably know the name of who that person is. The reporter definitely knows the name of who that is in most cases, but we're concealing their identity for a certain reason. So it's not that we're just picking someone up off of Twitter and just using the information that they give us. So if we can kind of meet at a point where these assumptions don't need to be made because we are informing the public of how we did the job, then hopefully we can kind of have this mutual understanding to build off of. The other goal that we really want to do too is to have news organizations increase their engagement with their audience. So this was mentioned earlier on the panel before. It used to just be a bunch of old white guys that were making decisions about what content was given, and they were making those decisions. Well, in some cases that still is true, and we need to be better, but can we then as journalists ask our communities, what were we missing? Did we miss a certain element of the story? Is there a community that we left out of the conversation? And when we ask that and we get that feedback, we can then decide to act on it and hopefully make the coverage better. Maybe go out and do an additional story involving that community on that same subject and linking it all together. So it's also this engagement component as well.
Yeah, and I know in the study that you did, Dr. Clark, there was mention of this as well, that of really understanding how the gears are working behind the scenes, very much affecting the minority community's different responses to the media. Can you kind of enlighten me on that one?
Absolutely. It's interesting that you mentioned not just taking a source from Twitter and kind of plopping it into a story, because that was one of the problems that the individuals that we talked to for our specific report on Twitter subcultures, Black Twitter, feminist Twitter, Asian American Twitter, mentioned when they talked about the process of making the news. That instead of source development being something they saw with their communities and the potential for engagement on these social media platforms, what they saw was journalists swooping in, taking the conversations that they were having and using them without proper context. And so one of the problems that they talked about was a lack of engagement that goes beyond what we know as the traditional shoe leather reporting, where you got out, you met people in the community, you spent time in the coffee shops, and you went to the different houses of worship to meet people, when you can see them all online, or at least the ones who use those social media platforms. So they were looking for more ways to engage with people, to get them to actually not just take from those communities, but actually engage in equitable relationships with those communities, give and take, being able to exchange information and thus inform coverage that way.
Now, this one, I'm kind of interested in getting a quick take from all of you on this one, because it's intriguing to me. Just last week, Pew came out with a study that said that research is now suggesting that younger people are better at discerning opinion from older audiences. And I'm wondering if this gives you guys some hope that some of this idea of kind of the trust factor and the transparency, media literacy, that it's working, and if there's hope for the future based on this. Who wants to take it first?
I'll go first. No. No. I still think we have a big issue, and younger people have huge issues. Younger people, so y'all know what the New York Times is. It means something to you. Young people, it doesn't have the same cachet. It doesn't mean as much. And when you consume your news on a platform like Facebook, now they don't do it on Facebook, but Instagram or whatever, all the content looks identical. That's what Facebook's really good at. And platforms, they make the content look exactly the same. If you search on Google, the result for junknews.com versus highly trusted reputable source look identical to you. And in fact, the bad guys are getting really good at mimicking what the good guys try to do. So I think we've really done a poor job educating the middle schoolers and high schoolers how to be better at discerning real from fake. The Stanford History Education Group here has done amazing research developing a curriculum, but I think they show that this is a problem. And so I guess what I would say is I trust Pew. I think they're reputable, but if they say younger audiences are better than older audiences, I would say they're both really bad. How about that?
Everybody's bad.
So I actually disagree a little bit with that. I'm a millennial, and I very much own that. And I think that the younger audiences are better than the older audiences because they know social, they know digital, they know how to fact check, they are used to fact checking, they're used to seeing one article and then looking to see where else it goes. That's how they are consuming information. So to me, when I saw that study, I wasn't surprised. I do think it gives me some hope, but it actually really, really worries me for the immediate future because I was doing some research about what media literacy programs are out there for a story that I'm writing, and a lot of the projects are based on K through 12, which is great. It's good that it's there. But there isn't a lot that's focused on once people are college age, people my parents' age. And my mother doesn't know how to use Facebook. I love her dearly, but she doesn't know how to. So there is this audience that I think does need this education because it's not something that they know how to use as well. And so can we reach them? And as far as what I was seeing with just the groups that are working in this space, most are working with K through 12. A good thing, but we need more to work with people that are not necessarily in school aged.
Well, I would just say, I resist any kind of general characterizations by age group or any other group. The study itself, I think, really ended up evaluating more how attached are you to your perspective as opposed to how well do you discern news from opinion, because it had to do with people assessing specific statements, and is this fact or is this opinion? What we found in our user research, and I said we went across race, class, gender, generation, geography, we found these kinds of problems at every level, and we also found these avid news users in younger people, in older people. Sometimes we were really surprised at how unfairly surprised about how amazingly adept older people were at figuring out what they were looking at online and using the social networks in order to gather information from a lot of different places, check, cross-check it, and push it out there. Millennials were the same way. I mean, some of the ones that we talked with, and really felt in a way that it was their duty to get out there and correct the record. So I feel I'm just naturally optimistic anyway, but I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic across generation.
I'm always naturally cautious, and that caution comes from working with young people at the collegiate level, and then also coming out of newsrooms and always wondering what is coming next. And so on one end, I'm very encouraged that young people can pick out statements and separate fact from fiction, but I'm concerned about technologies that may disrupt their ability to do so. And what I'm thinking about is heavy engagement with visually based technologies, specifically with social media, Instagram being one of the most highly adopted platforms among younger people, and technologies that are being developed now that can change everything from the appearance of a person to the way that their voice sounds. How do we train young people to be able to detect what looks real to them? And so that's one of my primary concerns. I would add that there is a study that was released very recently, I believe on October 12th, by Project Information Literacy. It was headed by Dr. Allison Head, and it looks at the way young people in college and high school in specific challenge the news, how they process the news, how they share the news. So there's a little more work that's being done. It's breaking news, I guess, about information literacy among older populations, older in college. But there are a few things that are still out there where people are working with the Gen Z, I believe, after the millennials.
So it's a mixed bag. We'll take that. We'll take that.
Half true.
Yeah, it's half true. Yes, exactly. Knowing this crowd, having sat in this class over the last few weeks, I know everybody wants to talk about politics. I know that the questions come up all the time. So Aaron, looking at the coverage of U.S. politics, and especially when we're talking about the midterms, has fact-checking helped in terms of all of these issues, in terms of media literacy, misinformation, trust, since it's been around, for a while now? You guys have seen it all in a way.
Well,
how much has it changed now?
So I guess my first answer is I hope so. So I'm optimistic about fact-checking. No, I think that after the 2016 election, everyone kind of looked at fact-checkers and said, Trump lied way more than Clinton, but Trump was elected. You guys failed at your job, right? We never saw that as our job. I think we can go into the specifics of the election, but I'll set that aside. Our job as a fact checker is not to tell you who to vote for. I don't want you voting for the most honest candidate. I don't think that's necessarily the best measure. It's a measure, but it doesn't have to be the only one. I think we have been effective we started in 2007, so our first election was 2008, so that was our third presidential election. I think we have kind of really broken through as a type of journalism, so that newsrooms across the country now are having a conversation about when they tell a story, are they going to do it through a Q&A or a narrative or a video or a photo? I think now telling a story as a fact check is something that a lot of newsrooms are thinking about, which I think is really good. The research on fact checking is amazing in that it doesn't change how you vote necessarily, but you as a reader, when you read a fact check, you retain the information better and longer than if you read a straight news story. And the second thing, which is the president aside, the threat of being fact checked oftentimes makes politicians more cautious and careful about what they say, which is a good thing. I can't measure it, but there is research that we did in some of the states where we have relationships where we sent lawmakers lawmakers were set into three groups. Group one was the control group. Nothing happened to them. Group two got a letter that was kind of like League of Women Voters style and was like, hey, it'd be really good if you told the truth because it's good for democracy to tell the truth. Please tell the truth. The third group got a letter that said, PolitiFact is in your neighborhood. They are going to be watching the things you say. And if you say something wrong, they will set your pants on fire. Don't lie. They tracked fact checks for a year. The group that was least likely to tell the falsehood was the one who got the threat. And so I think there's effect we're having. It's not nearly enough. We are, Michael said, we're the largest fact-checking organization in the United States. We are 12 people, okay? So, and I'm here with you, and the president's probably somewhere talking. So we can't do everything. So the other thing we have to do is train you and everyone to be their own fact checker. And so like Sally's trust indicators, one of the cool things that they also do is they kind of work in reverse. So if you look at her indicators and say, what websites don't have that stuff, that could make you say, I should be a little skeptical of that. We need to be teaching you how to do reverse Google image searches, how to do lateral reading, which is to kind of move from website to website, how to look for proper sourcing, how to see if you can see on a website, oh, I can contact the author. That looks like a real person. That's a good sign, So I think we have a lot more to do in that regard. But I think we've made progress over the 11 years that we've been doing it, and happy.
I have one last one I'd like to hear your guys' take on before we open it up to some of the questions from the audience here. And we have a study that came out a few weeks ago about the spread of news deserts, which we talked a little bit about here last week too. The loss of local news, places where there's not necessarily a local newspaper, a local TV station, or local media anymore. And I'm curious to hear, especially because you're coming from some different backgrounds and have talked to a lot of people in the field, how much is that affecting trust and affecting the work that you're doing? To whoever wants to go first.
One of the biggest complaints that we hear, that our partners have heard, is that people don't understand, if they're reading their local newspaper, why something comes across and it says Associated Press. And that makes them either very angry or they don't understand how that content got in there and how the local journalists, were they involved in the process? Did they have anything to do with it? Any of that. So that type of, so the news desert, right? If there is this news desert, if there are less journalists, you're going to be using more content that is coming from the Associated Press, that's coming from maybe your corporate reporter that's in DC, any of that. And what we found is that audiences generally, that does make them sort of question or maybe distrust that information that's coming because it's not coming directly from their local news organization or that local reporter, and they wonder, why didn't you send someone to DC? And so what we are seeing is that's a complaint and kind of a cause of distrust when they aren't seeing their own local reporters reporting the content.
Yeah, I just feel what's happening to local news is devastating to not only the information system, the quality news we need to be getting from every level, but also to trust overall. Because one of the things, when I told you that people are interested, they want to know, does this journalist understand my community? Does this journalist understand me? And as Lynn can tell you, there's strong trust in the local news organization. So if you're just getting news from a national site only, and you don't see your own community, your own selves in the news, then you're much less likely to trust it. And that's something we heard across the board too. We heard from people saying, we want to hear from people like ourselves in the news. We want to hear from people unlike ourselves in the news, not just at high levels of business and government. So when you think about, that's what national news does best and international news does best, is bring you to the voices of people at high levels of business and government, but not the local news. And national news tends to pull from local news. So it really does undermine the quality overall of what we're getting.
I would want to complicate our definition of local news and what we're thinking about when we talk about local news. If it's the papers that were run by major corporations that used to be in our towns that have shrunk in size, that are no longer there, they've left, and it's not so much a news desert as it is a news ghost town, that there were people that were there. This isn't a naturally occurring phenomenon. I'm curious about whether we're including the perspective of ethnic newspapers, of specific language-based newspapers, and organizations that have been there, that have been reporting on the communities, but are overlooked because they are not what we continue to think about as local news. So I'd start by complicating the question. And then I am not as, I would say, concerned from the perspective that I think this is something, it's a single solution that we need to address. I think it has great historical implications in that if news organizations had established stronger ties with the communities they served and all of those communities that they serve, I asked the question whether they would have more buy-in from people who could potentially subscribe to the paper, who could support the advertising revenues and patronize the advertisers that are trying to cater to a number of diverse audiences. And I think about that in terms of my own hometown's newspaper. The story that gets me is that in 2004, I was 24 years old, and the paper ran a correction on the front page. It was about 22 words. It said, the Lexington Herald Leader has, it's come to our attention that the Lexington Herald Leader has failed to cover the civil rights movement. The editor regrets the error.
Wow.
So some 50 years later, admitting that there is a whole segment of history that, as Alex mentioned earlier, a few white guys in a room decided was not important enough to cover. That alienates an entire generation of people. Those people are potential subscribers, they're potential contributors. And having made those choices then, we're seeing the effects of them play out now in local news.
We just got, that was good. I'll simply say, I always got to talk. In the fact-checking world, local fact checks are way more tangible, and so they do build trust. And so we've seen this play out in the work we do. If I told you the traffic in Palo Alto is just excellent and always the roads are always free and clear, you would throw tomatoes at my face because you know that's not true. if I told you that there was a caravan of angry migrants coming to knock down the border, you can't see that with your own eyes. So then you have to come to your political beliefs to say whether or not you think that's true. So I think the more we can do at the local level, of course it can build trust because you can participate in the stories in a way you can't when we don't cover local communities and issues.
All right, we're going to go to some audience questions here. This is a great one for us to start with. So, would you all address the case of two sides? The binary, he said, she said, this person said this person said that approach to news, where it involves, discriminating, exclusionary, racist issues, especially. How that's affecting our news, but also if there's, what the danger is for all of us when we're focusing on this he said, she said situation. And this is to all of you. So whoever would like to take that one.
Well, I can certainly speak about concerns about this dichotomous approach to journalism that insists that there are two sides to every story. I've taught my students for years now that there are many sides to every story. Herbert Gans, when he did his seminal study on American newsrooms, came out with recommendations that talked about multi-perspectival journalism. So providing multiple perspectives to the news stories that we see so that people can use the information that we are producing to make decisions in their everyday lives. In order to make really informed decisions, you need to have a multiplicity of voices involved in those stories. When you boil things down for the sake of reporting on deadline, reporting to a particular space, and reporting for a very narrow audience, you miss so many parts of the story. And what you can wind up doing, and what I think we're seeing now, is normalizing voices that do not belong in mainstream media. Normalizing positions that are harmful, that use inflammatory rhetoric to espouse their points, that just do not belong. They are not legitimate. They can be quite dangerous. But if we rely on this old trope that there are two sides to every story, then there's no contesting that because I got this one person who said something that was totally radical, I now have to get someone else who's totally radical, and I don't get to work in the middle at all.
Anyone else want to add to that one?
I'll simply say that, sorry, I'm going to do it again. PolitiFact was founded really to combat this idea of he said, she said reporting. The origin story of PolitiFact is 2004 Republican National Convention. Zell Miller, a Democrat, is giving a speech in support of George W. Bush, lays into John Kerry over defense spending. Our founder read the stories the next day. Zell Miller said John Kerry's terrible on defense spending, quote, quote, quote. John Kerry pushed back saying this was all untrue, quote, quote, quote. Zell Miller defended what he said saying, quote, quote, quote. End of story. If you read it, you had no idea who was right. And as a journalist, I think it's incumbent on us when we can take the time to say who's right and who's wrong. And we don't have to give equal weight to the wrong side, right, on matters of fact. And so that's the story of PolitiFact.
Well, we're going to keep you on deck here, so
Okay.
get your water in fast. The audience would like to know who decides, what PolitiFact decides to fact check and how, and who checks the fact checkers.
The second part is
Watches the
easy.
watchman.
You all check the fact checkers. Trust me. If we get something wrong, people will find out, will quickly alert us, and we will issue a correction. In fact, if you really want to see all our errors, you can go to PolitiFact.com and look at our subject tags. We list every correction we've ever issued. And so when we make a mistake, it's often because we didn't have information. It's usually not because we were wrong. A lot of times politicians will play games with us. They won't participate. We'll issue a verdict and they'll say, I can't believe you missed this. Well, it's usually because we didn't know it existed. How do we pick what we check in the process? Real briefly, we choose what we check using news judgment. So our reporters every day look at the top of the television news, the front page of the newspaper, what are the big stories people are talking about, and then we go in search of things to fact check about them. We do not keep a tally where it's like a Republican today, a Democrat tomorrow. We do not keep a tally if it's like a true today, it has to be a false tomorrow. We make news judgments about what we want to fact check. However, I will say, we do make sure we fact check everyone. No one is off limits from the truth-o-meter, and we make that really clear. From there, the one thing I want to highlight about our process is a reporter goes through the process and does our fact checks. The reporter recommends a verdict, a rating, but the reporter actually doesn't decide. We have 3 editors who sit as a jury. They read every fact check I've been on most of the 16,000 that we've published over 11 years. We read, sit, we have jury instructions, like 4 questions we ask ourselves. We go through that process and we issue that verdict. 75% of the time we're in unanimous agreement. If it's a 2-1 vote, so to speak, we'll use maybe it's a case to do more reporting or ask questions, where are the holes. Sometimes we just kind of agree to disagree and we move on. But every process is pretty thorough. It takes at least a day usually to do a fact check. Sometimes it could take a week or 10 days. And sometimes that conversation, that jury conversation, can be 30 seconds. Some days it can literally go over a day because we're kind of hanging up the phone at each other, arguing about what we think it should be. So.
Right. Well, knowing that we only have 5 minutes left, I feel like this is a good one that we can each give one example of. So, we've talked a lot about what we do, what we in media are trying to do to solve these problems, but we'd like to know what can the consumers of news do to solve this problem, to do their own fact checking, to fight disinformation, all of the above. I know there's a lot, so I'm going to say one from each person. And Lynn, I'm going to start with you.
So kind of building off what you were just talking about, something that we encourage and try to get our news organizations to do is, if you are in the public and if you see something that's incorrect, please let that news organization know. The thing about journalism is, yes, we are reporting on the facts, but we're reporting on the facts from the time that we are writing the story right in that moment, right? Things change. There might be something that happened right after deadline was pushed, and yes, we should do an update and there needs to be an update, but the thing you are reading is in a slice of time with what was known at that moment. And a lot of times we may not get information. Talk about politicians and the government. They are so hard to get information from nowadays. It's become really, really difficult. So if you ever see something that you think is incorrect, please contact that news organization. Let them know. If you have a document or just any kind of information who they could talk to so they can correct it, please let them know. That's going to go a long way.
I'll go next. Thanks again for having me. I would say, how many people know someone on social media who shares what you would consider fake news? Interact with these people, okay? Trust me, I don't want to do it either. However, everyone has the crazy Uncle Joe, right, who shares the kooky stories. Typically, we just avoid the conversation because, oh, that's crazy Uncle Joe, just being crazy. What I really should suggest is, this is a public health crisis, and so we will do better the more we are all engaged. And so, as difficult as it may seem, and as much as you might not want to, it might be helpful to say, hey, Uncle Joe, where'd you get that information from? And then, can I show you a couple other stories that might help you understand? You don't have to do it in a mean way. You don't have to say you're fired, you're a liar, whatever. Have a nice conversation. Because I think what we definitely know is the best way, so I can't change how you vote, and I'm not trying, but the best way people can change how other people think are based on people they know, right? So people who know each other having a conversation about issues and facts can have a much better resolution than if I was trying to come in, or if Facebook was trying to come in, Lord help us, and say, this is wrong. So engage, talk. Tell crazy Uncle Joe I said hi.
So?
Well, and I want to echo the thank you. It's a great questions, great moderation, great opportunity. I would ask you to really own the trust indicators. So you can find these transparency factors on locally on the San Jose Mercury News. You can find them on the Washington Post. You can find them on Tegna television stations around the country. You can find them on BBC. And look at our website, it's thetrustproject.org. And if you go to the list of the FAQ, you can see what the trust indicators are. and start looking for them. And if you don't see them, then there's a reason for questions. If you see them, then think about, well, how do these make sense to me? How can I spread these, spread use of these? So can you talk to your friends about them? Can you talk to your local librarian and get the library to use them in the various ways that librarians start to build media literacy? Are there teachers you can talk with? Are there groups that you might want to meet with to talk over the news and use these trust indicators as a way to engage folks? So again, the idea here is to really take ownership and be involved in making informed decisions about the news and helping one another. And those ideas came from a group very much like yours. So I think there's plenty of opportunity, and I hope you take it.
One thing about engaging with that crazy news, engage offline, because depending on the platform that you're using, engaging online may actually incentivize the posting. So one thing to consider. But I like to think about strategies and approaches more than solutions. I think of solutions being very fixed. And when we're talking about media, technology, and social norms, and how these things are always shifting, you want to think about the way that we can be responsive to the struggle of the moment. The challenges that we have right now are very different than the ones that we experienced last year or 10 years before. I would go back to the appeal that Lynn made about being involved, and think of yourself as a source. Looking around at the coverage that you get, see who's missing, whose voices are missing from the coverage, contact news outlets to let them know who's missing from the content. And if you know someone who could be an expert or who has a context or perspective that is necessary for those stories, put folks in touch. Media is yours. You are a part of this whole system. It does not work without your input, so be a source.
And I'm going to add in, as a moderator privilege, one more for you guys. I've studied disinformation and misinformation for years, and you mentioned earlier about the bad guys who are really good at looking like the good guys. So the fake news sites, the sites that are popped up out of nowhere, sometimes they're made by Russia, sometimes they're not, that are made to look like real news. And one of the things they don't do very well is sourcing. So if you're seeing a story and the facts are according to who, like you need to ask that question all the time when you're reading it. Who is this supposedly coming from? Because often they don't even say, or it's not even citing an anonymous source, it's citing a nobody source. It's just saying it like it's a fact. And if there isn't a source, if there isn't a quote, if there isn't a link, and if there is a link, it might be a link to another site that's just like that one. If you're seeing yourself going down a link rabbit hole where there's still nobody who is actually owning that information, there's a 99.9% chance that that is a fake story and a fake website and a fake reporter, and you should never go to that website again. And you should tell your friends that too. Yeah. So that concludes tonight. I'd like to thank our panel. And also, big thanks to Dawn and to Michael, too, for bringing this all together and bringing you all here. Yeah.
Well, 5 weeks certainly went fast, didn't it? I was thinking about the Carol Burnett song. I'm so glad we had this time together. Just want to say a couple things. Over these 5 weeks, we've covered a lot of territory. We had about 30 speakers, journalists, media analysts, media experts from around the country, from around the world, and around the block, and right here at Stanford and in Silicon Valley. So we've talked about how independent press protects press freedom, how one of the most important functions of a free press is to help hold the powerful accountable to the people, whether that's government, corporations, or maybe Facebook. You've heard journalists themselves talk about how to cover and how they're covering and navigating issues of personal identity while trying to inform the public on issues of bias, intolerance, and injustice. We had some local people talking about how failing business models and changing reader habits have really decimated the local news organizations in communities here in Silicon Valley and really all around the country, and how news startups are trying and emerging to fill those gaps. Tonight, we talked about the flood of misinformation online and how it's tainting the quality of information that we need to make good decisions. You also got over your initial shyness about asking questions. You had some great questions over these 5 weeks. So Michael Bolden and I have really enjoyed building this class and coming up with this journalism sessions for you. We greatly appreciate your interest in learning about journalism and about its role in democracy. I want to thank everybody who made this class possible. My co-host, Michael Bolden. Yay. All the talented people at Continuing Studies, there are many, I'll just name a few: Charlie Junkerman, Alexandra Agropopoulos, Jack Kirkner, and Amy Tofield. Thanks to the JSK staff, especially Enrico Benjamin, who's been up front here, who's doing our live streaming and social media, Erica Bartholomew, who's been the question whisperer. And in the back, John and Mike are the Stanford video and audio staff who were with us each and every night to keep us sounding good and looking good. So finally, I just want to end with, to echo the last panel and their conversation about how media does not really exist or survive and well without you. So I want a call to action to ask for all of your help. So we live in tumultuous times for our journalism, for our democracy, and really around the world. So access to relevant, truthful information is really key to what we need to sustain our communities, wherever they are. Quality information is crucial to supporting democracy. And we all know for certain there are such things as facts and the truth. They do exist. So here's what I'm going to ask of you. Support your local newspaper and news organization, your local radio station. Yes, read the New York Times. But more important, your local media needs you more than ever. How are you going to know what's going on if they just disappear? There's a quote I read recently that is a little dark, but I thought quite telling, which it said, "First they came for the journalists, and I did not speak up because I was not a journalist." We have no idea what happened after that. So live your ideals. Seek out ways to help journalism. All of you are here because you're interested in journalism and democracy. Stay informed so you can fully participate in your community, in the life of your community. Keep your eye out for other events like this. There will be others, not necessarily from us this next quarter, but the Continuing Studies program has sessions. The JSK Fellowships may have some sessions in the future. And partners that we have who are actually in the audience tonight, the Stanford Journalism and Democracy Initiative, the JDI, which is the Brown Institute for Media Studies, and the Stanford Journalism Program and JSK, will have occasional events. And then adopt a journalist. Find journalists. Obviously, we're people that you can talk to. You can reach out to them whether you have a question, whether you have a correction, whether you have information about something they should know about. And get to know them. Help us help journalism thrive, because our world depends on it. Thank you, and good night, and good luck.